Very good morning from the UK and Europe side, joining Singapore and other global audience and panelists today. Thank you so much, Jane, and panelists. You're going to introduce yourselves very shortly, but I just wanted to say that I'm really excited about this panel. The topic was about RegTech adoption, and our decision was to focus on financial crime because it's such a huge and critical area. And often when RegTech is talked about, it's very general. So it's going to be a very lively discussion today, I know. And I'm really excited to hear not only, the answer to, are we there yet? And I think, there's no surprises there, we're not. But it's kind of like, well, what's good? Where's the gaps? And what can we do about it? Collaboration really is the key. And there's a following panel on that. So we want to inspire people working in these areas, to think about how we can collaborate to improve. But yeah, so really excited. Thank you, Jane. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm delighted to be here. We've got a great panel for you, and we're looking forward to this discussion. My name's Jane G. I'm a director at my own company, G Associates Limited, and I also am company secretary at a RegTech called Numitor, which I've recently joined. So I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves, but I just wanted to set the scene a little bit because in the UK, there's a great focus at the moment on financial crime, and there was an parliamentary research report back in April this year, which basically said that the precise scale of economic crime in the UK is unknown, but it could run to tens or hundreds of billions of pounds per year. The extent of these crimes, including money laundering, fraud and corruption, led the Intelligence and Security Select Committee in its report back in July 2020, their report on Russia. They said that London is considered a laundromat for corrupt money. Second thing I just wanted to mention is there's just been an all-parliamentary group report on a manifesto essentially on economic crime, which is well worth reading. It was actually published in March, but it was relaunched on May the 18th this year. And Margaret Hodge made the point that Britain is now the jurisdiction of choice for too many criminals, kleptocrats and wrongdoers who use us to hide their dirty money and then use our structures and professionals to clean their ill-gotten gains so they can bring them into the legitimate system and spend them. She said illegitimate wealth is damaging our reputation as a trusted jurisdiction and seeping into our democratic and public institutions. It doesn't have to be like this, and in the long run, Britain cannot get and stay rich on the back of dirty money. And I guess that's true of almost every jurisdiction. But what I'd like to do is to come back to some of those general points later, and I'd like the panel to introduce themselves, please. So Sam, could I start with you, please?
Sure. Thanks, Jane. Hi to everybody. My name is Sam Sheen. I am a subject matter expert in financial crime prevention. I currently work as a financial crime prevention expert and technology advisor to the Council of Europe, where I advise them on setting up regulation for innovative businesses, including cryptocurrencies. And I'm currently working with a RegTech digitizing their onboarding process, including their AML controls.
Thank you very much, Sam. Jess, can I come to you now, please?
Yeah, sure. Lovely to be here. My name is Jess. I'm head of financial crime project delivery at Fintrail. Fintrail is an anti-financial crime consultancy. So we support all types of financial institutions to build, scale, refine, assure different financial crime frameworks. So we do everything from designing onboarding flows all the way through audits. And as part of that, we often sort of get involved in selecting and implementing different RegTech tools for lots of different clients. So hopefully I can bring some kind of practical experiences from that into the conversation today.
Great, thank you, Jess. Martin, I'm not going to just do ladies first. We'll do you next, please, if we may.
Great, thanks. So pleasure to be here. I'm Martin. I'm CEO and one of the co-founders of Acuminor. And we are a RegTech company, so it sort of makes sense for us to be here, or me to be here. But we specialize in financial crime, threat and risk intelligence. And that intelligence feeds into pretty much any part or every part of a financial crime framework. And hence collaboration is as a core piece of what we do and who we are. So I'm really looking forward to being in this panel.
Thank you, Martin. And last but not least, Sarah, if I could come to you, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah George. I'm a partner at Sidley Austin, a large American law firm based in London, and I'm a specialist in white-collar and regulatory investigations and government investigations. My former career was as a prosecutor for the Financial Conduct Authority, and in that capacity, I was very interested in the use of the financial services system to further financial crime. So my interest in this area is very much around payments, innovations, but particularly money laundering offences. Thank
you very much, Sarah. Well, certainly it's great to have people with good practical experience. And Sarah Sinclair mentioned at the beginning that essentially we're here to kind of debate the issue of, are we using the available technology to the best effect? And as is mentioned on our sort of crib sheet, the answer to that is generally no. Does anybody want to say that they disagree with that, and that actually we are using the technology to the best effect? I don't think anybody's going to do that, so I'll move on. I actually think that there's plenty of practical knowledge that we're going to be able to share with you. Martin, I'd like to come to you, if I may. One of the issues that's been talked about is, would certification help? And it has been mooted that there should be, in other areas like security, it's helped if that is a certification system. So do you think there should be some system devised for, and how would that kind of system work?
My gut feeling would be probably not so much. And the reason for that being that, first of all, the practical questions, who should, issue such certifications, right? We have plenty of certification organizations out there, but still, that's going to be an issue. But first and foremost, I think this might sound a bit harsh, but I think we are looking at something that's going to be pretty Darwinistic the coming years. So first, on the RegTech side, if you don't know the market on the problem you're trying to solve, and I don't mean the technical sides of it, but the actual, why are we doing this, you are going to struggle in order to sort of know where you fit in this huge jigsaw puzzle of a financial crime framework. That's just how it is. So I foresee that's those companies that don't have the subject matter expertise, they will face some challenges in that. And I don't really see that any certification could really solve that. It's sort of a, why do you exist? And that also comes to the buyer side. I think also, it is impossible to comply using manual processes. It's just how it is. You're doomed to fail. So if, your competitors that are more prone to adopt swiftly and in a good way, they will, you will be chasing them, and then you see them disappear in the horizon together with your customers. So I think it's I have a Darwinistic approach, and I don't think a certification would do much good. Maybe for some, but it won't solve the whole thing.
Okay, and I do think that one of the points that's made quite strongly in some of the research papers is that we don't have a very good taxonomy for RegTech solutions. So we haven't got them segmented, we haven't got them divided up. So if you were going to have a certification system, you'd need to have something pretty good that could tell you where that particular RegTech fitted into the sort of RegTech scheme of things and the market itself. Does anybody disagree? Does anybody think that certification would solve some problems?
I think it's going to be very, very complicated to implement. And I agree with everything you said, Jane. But on the flip side, from the buyer perspective, we often work with quite a few sort of startups or smaller scale institutions where they really have no idea where to start. And if you did have some kind of certification regime, that's where they could start to say, well, okay, we know that this RegTech solution is certified to a certain standard, therefore we have confidence in it. Because at the moment, what people are doing is just relying on reputation. So what have other people used? What have other institutions used? And if you're a smaller scale startup, you might not have that network available. So I think there are some benefits to it, but it would be very, very complicated to start implementing.
Yeah. Interestingly, Jane, there's kind of a weird thing that's happening in Europe, which is we may not even need certification soon. And the reason why I say that is a lot of the regulators now have the power, and some of them are in fact going to visit the RegTechs that financial institutions use. And so part of the selection process is also about, well, how good will they look if my regulator goes to visit them? So, we currently know that 2 of the biggest video ID providers have been visited by the German regulator, for example, to see exactly what they're providing the different businesses who've engaged them to help them with their onboarding processes. So, it's interesting we talk about certification, but it may be the case the tide's turning and regulators might be more open-minded to say, well, actually, we'll decide and go check them out ourselves. But it's for you to take on the risk if you want to use them.
Thank you. Now, I think those are really interesting points, and I do think the regulators getting more involved could well be an answer. In the Insight report that the FCA commissioned last year, if anybody hasn't read that, it's well worth rereading or reading it from scratch, because that report talks about there's no doubt that the regulators do have a role to play. Smaller firms do ask the regulator for advice and help on, who they should choose. And of course, we know that the regulators need to remain technology neutral and they can't support any particular company. But one does feel that they could go further. And it's interesting that BaFin are already doing that. Now, Jess, if I could come to you, I'd like to talk about what the key adoption challenges are. I don't want to get too sort of negative about this, but I do realise that there are issues that people are uncovering all the time. And I think we know some of them. We know a little bit about over-promising, stating that you can do everything, which is one of the things that some RegTechs have done in the past. And, the lack of credible typologies. So we're getting to see more synthetic data coming in, and the FCA has got a consultation out now on synthetic data. So what are some of the practical things that you've encountered?
Sure, you picked up on loads of really interesting points there. And I think one of the biggest challenges that firms have when they start to think about adopting a RegTech solution is actually setting out the methodology to assess all of these different points. So making sure that you do have a properly defined and clear methodology to select your different RegTech tool, making sure that you're documenting that. And I know that the Monetary Authority in Singapore have a set framework that you have to adhere to, for example, to make sure that you are risk assessing that tool right at the start and very clearly. And what we see at the moment is lots of people at the start not setting that out and just going to look for the immediate solution that they need. So if they need a tool to do ID and V, they look and say, right, that's the immediate requirement that I need. Actually take a step back and think, what are the other requirements that other parts of your business need? Have you thought about whether or not that tool can actually do other parts of your framework? How does it fit within your system? What are the other kind of business continuity issues and challenges? So there are lots of things that just aren't considered right at the start of that selection phase. So if I would pick out one core challenge, it's setting out that framework and having really clear and transparent conversations with the RegTech vendors at the start and asking the really challenging questions right up front.
Very interesting. How about you, Sam? I'm sure you've got some comments in relation to the challenges.
I would say Jess has hit right on the nail on the head, if you like, exactly what is a really big challenge. But let me flip it the other way, which is clients who aren't ready is a really big deal. Part of the reason for failure of some of these projects is the financial institution just hasn't mapped out what their processes are. They've got a bad process. They haven't improved it. They need to do regulatory changes, but they go out early and start shopping. And when it's time to actually sort of map out where it's going to fit into their system, they're still in the process of updating the fundamental workflows and requirements that they need. And it just clogs down the whole ability to go, well, what do we need? How is it going to work? What are the data points we're going to have to put into it? And I see a lot of projects that just basically get suffocated by just the time and energy that's needed. So I think it's really important when RegTechs go in is just find out about the level of readiness of clients, because you could invest a lot of time in someone who may not even have enough senior sign-off yet on the changes that are going to need just to put the technology in the first place.
That's very interesting. Martin, I'm sure you've come across some practical barriers to your own success, as well as solving them. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's also, I think, at least, what we found to be sort of our one key to success is to listen more than we speak. as you say, Sam, first of all, identify where are you today? Where do you want to be tomorrow? What's your future? What's your strategic objective? And maybe it's just, well, nice having met you. Let's talk again in 1 year. Maybe you're there then. And that sort of helps both, right? Because, I've been working in big banks myself. And most of you have. And the political challenges. You can have some really strong ambassadors and they're screaming but nobody really listens because they have this to do first and then this. And then maybe you can, get your money. So, it's just, it's a matter of biding your time, I guess, making sure you help them navigate their own political landscape and make sure that you can help them. And if you can't, not trying to sell them something that they can't use, because this is a waste of everybody's time.
That's a very good point, Martin. I think that's very pragmatic. Sarah, I will come to you, but I just wanted to say, I've been in a situation where, we've had lots of meetings with a large bank, maybe 30 meetings. Everybody's loved the technology, but the political barriers have been significant. And there isn't, in my book, one of the questions is, how do you succeed as a RegTech? Well, first of all, you have technology which works to prevent financial crime. That is the essence of things. But that's almost not something that people look at immediately. They don't look at how effective the technology is. They look at how it fits in with their systems, what difference it will make to their business. And it strikes me that there isn't anybody championing the cause of how effective is this technology in uncovering bad actors or what have you. So Sarah, do you have a view on that? Because I'm sure you work with some interesting clients.
Well, the first thing I would say is that the industry has moved so far from comprehensibility to the average person in the street that we've now got to a situation where moral hazard has had to be taken out of the system, where people can no longer be held responsible for policing themselves because they can't do it. And so effectively every bank is now taking on the responsibility for reimbursement, and that is now, I think, a game changer, because when people are no longer responsible for policing their own losses, for example, we know if there's a push payment fraud, the very high likelihood is you will be made good by your bank. When you've taken that risk away from people, then it changes the dynamic somewhat. They no longer feel quite so engaged in or pushing for solutions that protect them, because they expect that the financial services industry will take that responsibility away from them. But I think it's becoming particularly an issue for very vulnerable people who are now being forced into using technology that they probably would not have automatically chosen to use, but because the optionality has been taken away from them. So you're forcing people to use a system that means that they have to be protected, but they have to be protected from themselves. And the technology exists to do that. We know that you can track a person's use of an app. You can know that when the normal pattern of usage is not there, the likelihood is that its security has been compromised. We know that certain people would never buy certain products. If a person who has hitherto been extremely cautious suddenly has an enthusiasm for online gambling, it's an indication that something's wrong. However, what this does mean is that an enormous amount of personal data and personal information needs to be handed over to the RegTech suppliers in order that they can do their job well to protect individuals from themselves. And that means that we can have quite a conversation about use of that data, the willingness to provide that data. But I suspect at the moment we're in a situation where people are reluctant to have that data handed over to protect themselves because they don't actually have any liability when it goes wrong. They'll just look to the financial services provider to make them good. So I'm afraid you're always in a lose-lose situation unless we can have a sensible conversation about that.
Very interesting perspective. Jess, or Sam, would you agree or disagree?
Oh gosh, you're throwing me right in the middle of a hornet's nest here. You sort of damned if you do and you damned if you don't here. I think, honestly, if we can show people how to work smarter, not harder, using the technology, and we recognize that incorporating technology should be a painless experience for both sides of the customer story. So both the consumers, but also the staff who have to use it, that would be a massive game changer. It sort of feels to me right now that the rush to get in some form of RegTech sacrifices one of those two parties. And it's either we'll fix the bugs later, and the consumer ends up being exposed in some way, or they don't get the service they need, or they get sort of stuck in forever bot land, not being able to find a human being to help them. Or on the other side, we just create more busy work for our staff because, while it looks nice on the front end, it really doesn't do what it should do. And it exposes lots of vulnerability around financial crime, needing lots of remediation later on. So, it looks nice on the front end, pretty ugly on the back end, and creating more problems than solutions. So I kind of think that's the magic thing we haven't figured out yet. How do we make that sort of frictionless experience happen on both sides and still stop financial crime?
Very good. Yeah, I completely agree with you. Jess, do you have a perspective on that?
I think some of these really loop back to the point I made at the start, where you really have to make sure your RFP process, when you engage with RegTech, covers lots and lots of different points, including, assessing data, GDPR concerns, all of that right at the start, and making sure you have all the internal stakeholders across the business that you need to. So not just individuals in financial crime that might be looking at how good the tool is at effectively solving fraud, or, doing transaction monitoring, or whatever that tool is doing, but actually making sure you're bringing lots of stakeholders into the conversation. So have you got legal? Have you got your technology teams? Have you got data there? Have you got lots of different stakeholders in the room to then make those decisions right up front? And also, what is your testing like during the implementation process? Have you got a clear RFP process that covers both the assessment, the testing, the implementation, and then what that relationship will look like with the RegTech vendor in sort of BAU management as well? So I think it kind of loops back to all of that. Try and get it all done up front as best you can.
I think that's a good point. I mean, I do think one of the difficulties is that if you as a business, to what extent does a business have to say, I'm here to help stop financial crime? We'd all like to think that they have that mindset, but actually what they've got is a mindset which is, I need to do what the regulations tell me to do. In reality, why would you do more? And I do think that there is a missing link, which will come on to talk about, between technologies which do actually stop financial crime and the legislation, because if you over legislate and you give too much detail, you can't see the wood for the trees anymore. So I wanted to just come on to AI and the whole kind of a topic of, AI is a very generic term. I'm talking about, machine learning, natural language processing, some of the technologies that come under that umbrella. And I'd like to have a conversation with Sarah about this, because the legal aspects of, we're constantly told we have to explain what our technology does. So I'm a RegTech, I'm trying to sell, you need to have explainable AI. But can you actually explain your technology without revealing all the intellectual property that you can have in your system? And I think one of the issues is, how much should we compromise also on privacy rights to allow better detection? So those two issues, Sarah, if I can come to you, I think that those are quite knotty legal issues, really. And I personally think that even if you have an NDA in place, it's very difficult for a young business to say, this is how my system works. What do you think?
And I think you have so many problems here. One, firstly, is, of course, when you start explaining your security system, of course, the criminals are listening too. So you are necessarily compromising your own system. And as many resources as you put in, as many as 10 times that resource will be deployed against you. So firstly, you're compromising your system by the explanation. Secondly, there's any information sharing, especially if you're potentially information sharing with rivals as well, you have potential competition law implications. But I think the bigger issue is always going to be when people understand how much of their data is processed, they've become very nervous. We are now a society that realizes the value of our own personal information, our own personal data, and transaction data and things like that, necessarily the tools of your trade. People become uncomfortable about when they know about it. But without that, they probably wouldn't have given it much thought. But I think there's a political impetus here as well, that people are increasingly concerned about the misuse of their data. So they'll be prepared to allow it on an informed basis to protect themselves, but not necessarily to protect you.
I think that's a very interesting point. And I think, we are going to see something in the new legislation in the UK on data sharing. We were promised in the Queen's speech that we would have a second Economic Crime Act coming this year, and that will contain something on data sharing. Data sharing is an obvious way to prevent financial crime. And I do think that we are going to have to educate the public more broadly. As you say, people don't want to have their personal details shared. But if I think that I'm going to have my details shared in order to rule me out, in order to make sure that there is nothing going on that's suspicious, because the system needs to detect people who are suspicious, then perhaps I will be more prepared to do that. Martin, what's your take on that particular issue?
Yeah, it's also a slippery slope, isn't it? I mean, for us, I come from law enforcement, and the law enforcement community it's a constant discussion, as it should be, on exactly these topics, right? So I think the reason why we have this now is because we have basically put something that used to belong in the law enforcement space onto private actors. And here we are, right? This is basically criminal intelligence that we're talking about here. And the rationale, or so the constant battle between effective crime fighting and your own sort of right to privacy, etc. That's a balance. It should be a balanced scale with balance in it. Because, we should also remember that data is always, if you share data, it will be here forever. And today's community, maybe it's fine. We are democratic, etc., but in 10 years' time, who knows, right? Yeah. So that's the thing, right? So we should make very extremely conscious decisions, and always remember that there are two sides of this coin, and they should be contradictory. But if it's too effective, it might also be bad in the long run.
Can I just add,
Sure.
Jane, as well? The one thing, everything that Martin has just said is encapsulated in the most basic requirement under the data protection regs, right? Privacy by design. As a RegTech provider, you should be in a position to explain very clearly, not the specificities of the beautiful black box your AI sits in, but why is it that the way it is designed and the way it's going to be integrated will satisfy that privacy by design requirement? And I think that's where the problem is people don't know how to give that answer because they haven't designed their tech keeping that concept in mind. And the fact is financial institutions have to do that balance between AML and data protection, and they have to have that in mind with the design of any technology.
Very, very good point. I do think some of the points that the audience have made are interesting. A point about the good and bad RegTech vendors. Often it's the people behind the tech, which isn't really talked about that often. And I do think that that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because we talked about the fact that if other people are using a tech, then Jess mentioned, that seems a good recommendation. Who else is using this? How big is it? My joke is always, and I'm sorry to IBM for this, but, there used to be the old saying, nobody ever got fired for using IBM. Well, nobody ever got fired for using some of the larger data providers. So if they're being used, quite often the regulators will just tick those boxes, unfortunately. But what they don't do is we don't talk about who's behind the tech and how significant their reputation is in terms of are these people who have a really good motivation in terms of preventing financial crime, or are they people who are looking to make a quick buck and sell out to one of the larger data providers quickly? Any comments on that?
I think this sounds like I'm banging.
Martin, you.
But just a quick one on that point. But it loops back again to the original RFP process. Get the due diligence in right at the start, and don't overlook the fact that the vendor itself you need to do the due diligence and assessment on them.
Yeah, reputation of the vendor is critical. Martin, have you got a comment on that?
No, it's just every time we're in a procurement process, it's a nightmare process. No, don't get me wrong. It's very serious stuff, to put it that way. I mean, it could be, if not 100 pages, so pretty close. I think we onboarded a pretty big bank the other week, and I think we had something like 900 questions just on due diligence on us. So I mean, for a small startup scale up, that's awesome, because it helps us, keeps us on our toes, and we really need to become big now. When it comes to level of maturity and information security, all that stuff, and luckily enough, we are in pretty good shape. But I've heard stories from other vendors that have been pretty much surprised. A bunch of tech guys, they have an awesome solution, and then they get this. It's like, what the hell? So I mean, that's yeah, but it's good. This is the way it should be, right? Getting back to the Darwinism, I think it's since we are dealing with stuff that are so serious, and the potential impact if we mess up on, especially the customer side, is so big. Of course, we should be super, clean. So yeah.
Thank you. I think those are excellent points. One of the things that the research talked about, there was this report that was published last year, which the FCA commissioned from Insight, was talking about what do firms want. Two areas from the research that clearly stood out were vendor communication, which we talked about, and the technology integration. So the whole point of, if people say we're really easy to integrate with, our API is very straightforward, blah, blah, blah. There's, as Jess has mentioned, when you're on the buy side, you have to have a huge number of people in the room, don't you? Because, you may be the MLRO, but you can't make a judgment about the technology and the ease of integration. I mean, I know, Sam, you've probably had some experience in this respect. So where do you come from on that?
Oh man, you have to be friends with your IT team. You totally have to teach them and get them interested and curious about AML, but you really need to make sure you have brought them in early in the tech discussion before you get everybody else excited about the potential and the possibilities, because the truth is you may have a really complicated architecture to fit that solution in. You may have other projects going on that it's going to clash with. And you will not win the fight with your technology team just simply by stamping your foot down and saying the regulator says so, because the regulator says nothing about RegTech. So you've really got to build those relationships and get them involved early.
Yeah, finding the person who understands, one of the comments has been made, finding the person who understands both the regulation requirement and the tech. I was with somebody yesterday who started their career in computer science and ended up in the law, and it's at a very significant level, and it's an unusual combination. But it is at times very necessary. I mean, I'm sure, Sarah, you've had some issues as a lawyer with trying to get people to bring their technical team in. What's your experience been?
I mean, the primary issue has always been the law of unintended consequences, that you find that your system doesn't work quite the way you thought it was going to. Mostly regulatory principles are very high level. It's like having adequate systems and controls. What is an adequate system and control? Is it a system that never fails? That doesn't sound to me to be what it is, but that's often the way it's interpreted. So I'm normally coming at this from when it's gone wrong already, and I'm trying to explain away that actually adequate system controls does not mean a fail-safe system of control. That there's always an issue around friction and convenience, and also not creating too many. For example, false alerts or false positive fraudulent claims, which basically means that it's impossible for anybody to actually have ease of transaction. So that's where I tend to be coming at it. So I think there is needs to be a level of understanding that there's always going to be a question of calibration. There is always going to be a period of learning in. And if you start penalizing firms for innovation, then there will be no innovation. And ultimately, you're always going to be a few steps behind the criminals.
I completely agree with that. And I do think that's something that regulators particularly need to take on board, that you do need to experiment and they need to provide the opportunity. Of course, synthetic data is giving us that opportunity. Some of the questions that have come in have been talking about having a utility and, you know, should there be a utility that everybody can use? I'm going to turn this over to you to talk about, but my own sense about that is that if the public sector did a better job, if, for example, Companies House was checking identities and we had open registries, open company registries around the world, and they were checked, the data that was filed in them was verified, then that would be an enormous leap forward. I mean, this debate between what the private sector can do and what the public sector can do, which is in a way what Martin was talking about, you know, that we need to get better public sector technology rather than the technology which we've had, you know, and which most law enforcement don't have the latest technology because they can't afford it. So do you think a utility would work? Jess, what would be your take on that?
So I would probably agree with everything that you've said there about the differences and the challenges between the public and the private. But I think we are actually heading in the right direction, particularly in the UK. So obviously with the new economic crime bill coming up, but a lot of the things that are coming out of the FCA, they're really heading in the right direction and looking at, you know, having that warm environment for technology. So I feel like we are heading in the right direction. I'm not sure whether or not having a utility would be the complete answer, but I think we are certainly heading in the right direction with some of the options that we're kind of working on anyway. And I think we'll see more and more from the FCA in the UK coming out about, you know, more standards. So I think we're heading in the right direction.
Thank you. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I just wanted to talk about, you know, there are some things we've talked about that I think we'll be able to put links to so that the audience can have a look and read some of the materials that we've put forward. Talking about a template of the 900-page DD report, you know, I think that I can quite understand people being interested. But quite often we need to be careful with the technology that things aren't over-engineered. And I guess that one of the things that RegTech, you know, we talked about over-promising or, you know, overstating the possibilities. The next session we're going to go on to will be about collaboration. But I just in a final sort of sentence or so, how do you feel about, you know, whether that's going to be a good thing? So Jess, what do you think?
Sorry, I was literally just reading some of the questions.
Yeah, sure. Sam, I didn't let you say, what do you think about the utility point? Because I know you lost your connection. Do you think we should have a utility? Do you think a utility is a good idea? I said I thought that the public sector could do better in terms of the things that the data that we know, like at Companies House and like the tax authorities, you know, there are things that the public sector could and should be doing, which could form a much better bedrock for the private sector. Well, what's your feeling about that?
I kind of feel in some ways like the ship has sailed. I mean, I know of one utility right now, which is private. It's managed to get regulated in its sector. It does KYC. It only does it for the investment sector. It only does it for funds. It is streamlining KYC for a huge group of investment vehicles that wouldn't otherwise be possible. It saved them economies of scale. And they've deliberately gone and become regulated so that they have the credibility and the, if you like, the assurance provided by the regulator who watches over them. So the original idea was that sector itself, where they've been regulated, we're trying to set up a utility, but the politics just became so difficult that one private company came up with a creative way to do it all on their own. So I think in some ways that's the lovely thing about people who fund RegTechs, is they're really great at problem solving. I would love to see the public sector do something. We've seen countries who have been trying to do it. You know, Martin, you know, up at your end of the world, they've tried to do it. I just think it's kind of an open field, but I strongly think that the private sector is probably going to figure it out a little bit faster, provided it doesn't try to be all things to all people and all banks and just retail.
Very good, Sam. Thank you. Yeah, I do think that's a very good point that you've made. One of the things I wanted to come on to as perhaps a final thing. I think we're okay for time now. How are we going to get new laws? Are we going to get some tech-driven analysis of what the legislation should be? I mean, my feeling is that the law always lags such a long way behind in terms of I mean, we've seen this with crypto, that crypto people jump on bandwagons, NFTs are the same, and eventually regulation tries to catch up. Do you think that perhaps if we get some of these amazing people who've got both computer science and legal abilities, that we will eventually be in a situation where we'll get some laws that will help solve financial crime, which will be driven by the technology? Because if the technology, perhaps this is where the compromise may come on data protection, because if you have a good technology company which can prevent all sorts of financial crime by processing quite a lot of data, that will be permitted if it's done within the security of that particular company. But of course, that would require some legislation to enable that to happen. So you could be carving out exceptions to data protection by saying, if your sole purpose is to prevent financial crime, then yes, you can share the data, or yes, you can process that much personal data. I mean, this is where data analytics comes in, and all of us who work in financial crime are having to become data analytics experts pretty much. Martin, is that something that you can talk about?
I'm trying to unmute. Oh, that was a hard one. I don't know where I should begin, to be honest. Let me see. Well, first of all, I think the legislations are pretty good as they are, to be honest with you. I mean, if you just make sure that you ensure a risk-based approach, you can pretty much do what you want and what you have to, but you must be able to prove it, right? So, I mean, if you need to process a lot of data around a certain customer segment, I mean, knock yourselves out, right? As long as you can prove that you actually are, you need to do to comply with the email regulations. I guess the problem is that if you have such a vague conception of your actual threat and risk exposure, that you have no clue about the problem you're trying to solve, and you just throw technology and big data at it, then you might be, in the wrong place, right? Then you're starting in the wrong direction. So, yeah. But from a regulatory point of view, I guess it's pretty good. That would be my take.
Yeah, well, I do think, I mean, I'm sure, Sarah, you probably have a view on this in particular as a lawyer, but I do think, it would be interesting if we could do that tech-driven legislation. What do you think?
I think that legislation is so far behind the problem, usually, that you're solving yesterday's problems by the time it comes in. So I would be careful what you wish for in terms of legislation. I don't think there's going to be much appetite for watering down the protections around the GDPR at all. I think the public appetite is not there. And of course, laws are made by politicians and will be responsive to the public mood. But I do think that there's quite a lot you can do within the existing framework. And I think that looking at that and testing that framework would be the most smart way to approach this problem. I think there's also quite a lot of scope for using the regulatory principles as well. Often guidance is the right way to deal with this. There's often the authorities certainly the FCA, prefers to issue guidance around technological change and suggestions as to how it may be harnessed, but not actually fettering the discretion of firms as to what they must do. So I think in legislation, I'd just be a little bit careful what you wish for.
Thank you. I think that's a very good point. I mean, I did think one of the points that I'd made to myself was, is there a case for a law which is, everybody has an obligation to help prevent financial crime? You've got great solutions, but could we? But of course, it's the enforcement and the interpretation and all the other things that go with it. And quite sadly, and to make you smile, my old tutor used to say the function of the lawyer is to inject doubt where none existed before. So I'm going to wrap up now, and I would like to thank you all for your contribution. It's been a very interesting conversation. I do think that we will try and share some of those links, and if any of you have got points that you'd like to make, we've only touched a little bit on the use of synthetic data, and I know that, as I said, that there is an FCA consultation about that at the moment. I've been certainly persuaded by people like FinCrime Dynamics that the use of synthetic data is going to become very important for testing and for making sure that, because of the privacy concerns, that you can use data which is anonymized or at least not personally identifiable. That's going to be important. So I'm going to hand over now. I'd like to say thank you to each of you. It was a great contribution. I'd like to hand over to Sarah Sinclair. So she's going to just wrap up this session. Okay, Sarah, are you with us? And if she isn't, I've got a couple of more points to say, which is that public sector adoption point. It was just on the Companies House. They've had so many consultations, and now we've got the final white paper version, which is going to be, if Companies House do all the things that they say in the white paper, it will be amazing. Unfortunately, I have a feeling it's going to take 5 years or so for us to get there, which is quite a sad reflection. But eventually, Companies House will no longer be just a passive registry, but it will be an entity which positively checks the identity both of all the directors and the persons of significant control. And so in the UK, we are going to make it more difficult to use shell companies. Unfortunately, there are companies being formed. There are about 3,000 plus companies every day in the UK. And people like Graham Barrow are busy identifying, those networks which are exploiting the fact that we haven't got the change yet. So that's a very unfortunate situation. But it won't be long, hopefully, before some of those items are changed. So I don't know whether Sarah's going to come in. I don't think she is going to have the opportunity to do that. So I will just wrap up now. But again, thank you all for your contribution, and we will take questions if anybody's got them. I'm sure that Change Gap will be able to give us those questions if they need answering, and we can also publish some of those links that I've mentioned. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane, and the rest of the panelists. So indeed, it was a very insightful panel we got there. So following this session, that would be the amazing woman in RegTech. So see you there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.